All right, welcome back for the second installment, probably just of two at the moment, for where to find inspiration for your D&D campaign. Hopefully you watched the first video, which had the general advice, whereas this is going to have the more specific advice. Just to very quickly recap, the general advice was essentially look everywhere, pay attention to book plots, TV shows, the news, any place where you think you're going to come across a plot, a series of events that you think you could use, which is essentially everywhere. But you should focus on where I feel you're going to find useful material, which I believe with modern time constraints, movies are the way to go. I would recommend novels if you have the time, but for reasons I outlined in the last video, I believe movies are the way to go, and I'm going to elaborate on that here. So, first, to get the two super obvious examples out of the way, because I imagine if you're watching this video, you have probably seen these movies, and the off chance you haven't, go watch them, so you will know the super obvious example. The first are the Lord of the Rings movies. Yes, I guess you'd go ahead and include The Hobbit, even though they were lesser movies, but you should definitely watch the Lord of the Rings movies. That will let you see a fully realized fictional world, that has its own language intricacies. It feels like it has a history that it's lived in. You'll see a fully realized plot. Okay? Now, I wouldn't recommend copying said plot. You can take pieces from it, or if your players are down for it, I guess maybe you could copy it. It's up to you. And then the other super obvious example is the original Star Wars trilogy. Now, I have potentially hit some of you with a curveball by mentioning a science fiction movie as the uber example. So, first I should point out, Star Wars is science fantasy and not science fiction, because things in Star Wars work because George Lucas says they do, not because of any kind of scientific principles whatsoever. It is very much a fantasy movie with lasers and set in space, which is an important lesson you need to learn, in that you need to be able to take a piece of fiction and strip it down to its essentials, and this will allow you to see that you have all kinds of other genres to work with that are less obvious than what you're probably thinking right now. But the point of Star Wars is, if you watch it, either just the first movie, A New Hope, because it is a complete story unto itself, or the original trilogy, you'll see essentially the hero's journey as Joseph Campbell describes it. Look that up. I'm not going to sit here for the next 20 minutes explaining that, but it's a common trope in fiction all throughout history. So Luke is the hero in this particular case. Now, if you take a look at Star Wars, what do you really have? You have the guy who comes from nothing, the old veteran soldier / warrior, monk, space wizard, whatever you want to call him. You've got the evil empire, you've got a princess, you've got a guy who's essentially a space pirate, and his main henchmen who are going to turn out to have a heart of gold at the end of it. And the big bad evil enforcer who works for the big bad evil emperor, who has the big bad magic MacGuffin that can destroy planets. Okay? That is a D&D campaign right there. You just have to turn it into whatever setting you're doing it in. Take out the lasers, give everyone swords or crossbows. Take out the Death Star, make it an evil magic weapon. Take out, change Darth Vader's mechanical suit to maybe he's like half clockwork or something at this point. I don't know. Give him a much better sword than everyone else, obviously, because he's going to have a magic sword because of the lightsaber. Same thing with Obi-Wan Kenobi. And just go down the list, and you can easily turn the story into a fantasy story set in a fantasy setting with no trouble at all. So that's because it's science fantasy. You would have a more difficult time with Star Trek, because it tries to be science fiction. Whether or not it succeeds, that's up to the viewer, but you have a more difficult time. But there's probably plenty of ideas in Star Trek, by the way. And by that I mean the shows and the original movies and the Next Generation movies. Less so the Abrams movies, but I'm sure there's something there to work with. Who knows? They were popular enough. I suppose a more recent example would probably be I would stick with probably the first Avengers movie. It's a little more direct in that they are fighting an actual magic villain with a magic MacGuffin who wants to open a magic thing to let the big bad evil army through. And you got the characters have to overcome interpersonal issues and trust issues to try to stop him. It's a little less probably with Age of Ultron, although it's a similar-ish concept. Although they're the bad guys who can destroy the world. But I mean, the Marvel movies in general, there's material there to work with. You're probably going to find it more towards the magic end of the spectrum. But maybe the rest, I don't know. But those are the big, everyone has seen them kind of examples. So, if you want to go off the beaten path a little bit, first, the next more obvious stop is just any medieval fantasy thing. It can probably be adapted without a whole lot of trouble. It's just going to be a matter of figuring out what classes and races to make things. Because any given piece of medieval fantasy is probably just full of humans. Maybe some magic creatures here and there. So you're going to have to spice it up because the D&D settings have more than just humans in them. Don't be afraid to change the races of things, genders if you're inclined. And in a lot of cases, you're going to be dealing with a setting where basically 90% of the characters are level 1 fighters or something to that effect. So you're going to change things like that up a little bit to make it feel like it's actually going to fit in the setting. But the plot itself will feel like something that could fit into Dungeons & Dragons because of the medieval setting itself, because most of the campaign settings are medieval settings. So, next, I personally would look towards Westerns for plot ideas, because even though they involve gunslingers and firearms, the plots themselves are generally about an individual or a group who is dealing in a lawless territory and has to take matters into their own hands to solve some kind of problem, usually against an over-the-top villain of some kind. And so basically just take those and adapt them to a group concept, and depending on your setting, change the weaponry. But the idea of everything happening in the lawless Badlands, where the concept of right and wrong is just a luxury for the city folk, that is like 90% of a lot of D&D settings. There's the cities, and then there's every place else where a Western could easily play out, because there is no local law enforcement or anything like that. So imagine there, like I said, there are several Westerns you can go for there. Probably all throughout the genre. Just depends on what kind of characters you're looking for and settings. Like your John Wayne era, from what I'm given to understand, because I haven't really watched many of John Wayne's movies. They're more of your characters are more on the side of right and morality. The Clint Eastwood era that came a little bit later, the characters are a lot more willing to shoot first and ask questions later, if ever. So that's kind of a difference that you see there. They're more aggressive, willing to shoot a man in the back if he deserves it. That's just the kind of thing that you just wouldn't see in an older Western. So anyway, just something to consider as far as the differences in the eras. But, watch some of those, get your ideas on, those kinds of plots. And a lot of them are going to involve land and cattle, just fair warning. So beyond that, next I would go for sci-fi, because there are a lot of things there in science fiction, because a lot of science fiction, you have things which may as well be magic. And if they may as well be magic, well, it's Dungeons & Dragons, you just make them magic. So, you have that. A lot of science fiction tends to be closer to Star Wars than Star Trek. Hard science fiction just really doesn't sell in the movies. You can watch 2001. You can probably take some kind of inspiration from it with the monolith. Yeah, you can probably do something with that. Not what was done in the movie, but you can do something with it. But as a clarification, because in the movie, spoiler alert from a movie from the 1960s here, the monolith is an alien presence which was sent to Earth, that began mankind's evolution. And whenever mankind was able to reach the stars, another one was uncovered on the moon, which triggered another series of events because mankind had shown they had reached a certain point in their evolution, which was going to start the whole process over again on one of the moons of Jupiter, once Jupiter imploded from millions and millions of copies of the monolith and transformed it into another sun within our solar system, which should have wreaked havoc with planetary rotation and everything, but the movie pretends like it's going to be okay, so I guess it's going to be. That's from the sequel, 2010. Minor side note, totally off track here. If you ever watch one of those movies, you should definitely watch the other one to try to understand what happened in the first one. So, watch both of them. And you should probably also read the book. I'm given to understand they were created at the same time and meant to complement one another. But I haven't read the book, so I couldn't tell you. It's on the list. But anyway, so the monolith was responsible for the evolution of mankind. However, in Dungeons & Dragons, evolution is a concept that basically doesn't exist because magic. So, and it would, in Dungeons & Dragons terms, it would have been sent by the gods, and the gods don't work in mysterious ways in most of the Dungeons & Dragons settings. They work in very, very obvious, direct ways. So it's kind of difficult to fudge it in there, but someone out there, I'm sure, can find a way. So anyway, but like I said, most science fiction movies are not like that. Most of them are an excuse to use what's basically a fantasy plot, but with lasers. So they're easy to port over. Realistically, you can take parts of Independence Day and turn it into it, because the finale of Independence Day is basically using the concept of the Trojan horse, which has existed since ancient Greece and falls very firmly in the, yes, this could totally happen in a fantasy campaign concept. Which, speaking of, you should definitely read everything about the war for Troy in the Iliad and the Odyssey, because there's all kinds of stuff in there involving gods and warriors and magic and everything like that. So all kinds of inspiration there. But yeah, so Westerns and sci-fi, if you want to go for the less obvious approach, and learn how to adapt these ideas. Look at it and be like, think to yourself, how would this play out in D&D terms? And if you want an example or two to try to get you going down this path, consider the first 3 Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Now, the first one does kind of act like a standalone movie, whereas you need the other 2 to obviously complete a whole trilogy. But by the time you have the first 3, you're dealing with magic from ancient curses, deities that have been imprisoned and want to be let free, a villain who's very much like a lich. He even has a phylactery with his heart in a chest somewhere that you got to go find before you can kill him. You have the moral dilemma of, once he's killed, who will take his place? You have several characters vying for immortality. You have all of this. You have all kinds of agendas playing against each other. You have the fantastic setting of the high seas. It's all there. You know, so that's my example of, look at this. That would be fairly easy to adapt. And once you think, you know, you can do something like that, begin looking at other things, you know, and, you know, start watching lesser known sci-fi, fantasy, horror movies. There's all kinds of monster ideas in horror movies, you know, just got to look for them. Or just to get an idea of behavior of existing monsters, you know, just in case you somehow don't know how a zombie acts. I don't know how that'd be possible at this point, but maybe. Likewise with vampires, you know, there's volumes of movies to help you on this if you need it. So, that's my slightly more in-depth suggestions and where to go off the beaten path to look for ideas. So, good luck and Godspeed.